Silence was supposed to mean safety. Everyone believed the danger stopped at the edge of their land. The mistake was ordinary, almost invisible, what they ignored after nightfall. By the time something felt wrong, it was already inside their routine. And once you see what was watching from the dark, safety never feels real again.
The forest has a way of keeping secrets. In the deep woods of the American South, specifically the rugged spines of the Appalachian Mountains, there is a silence that feels heavy. It is a silence that watches you. In 1843, that silence was broken by something that wasn't supposed to exist. Imagine you were a plantation owner in the Tennessee or North Carolina highlands. You believe you have total control. You believe the world is ordered with you at the top and your property at the bottom. But then, livestock starts disappearing, not by wolves, not by bears, but slaughtered with the precision of a butcher. Then tools vanish, then smokehouses are emptied. And finally, you wake up one morning to find a weapon missing from your own bedside table and a single muddy footprint on the floorboards. You realize then that the woods aren't empty. You realize that the thing you fear most isn't a ghost, it's a man who knows your schedule better than you do, a man who was once your property, but now your predator. This is not a story about the Underground Railroad. This isn't a story about a desperate run for the Canadian border. This is the story of the men who didn't run away, the men who ran in, the men who escaped into the wild heart of the South and stayed there, transforming from slaves into the most feared mountain men of the 19th century. To understand why this happened in 1843 and why it terrified the Southern establishment more than any Northern abolitionist ever could, we have to strip away the romanticized version of history we were taught in school. We have to look at the outlier. The year 1843 sits in a strange, tense valley in American history. It is nearly 2 decades before the Civil War, but the cracks in the system are already showing. The laws regarding fugitive slaves are becoming more draconian. The South is militarizing its patrols. The narrative being pushed by politicians and newspapers is that African Americans are naturally submissive, incapable of surviving without a master, and biologically unsuited for independence. This lie was the foundation of the entire Southern economy. If a slave could not only survive in the wild, but thrive, if he could master the mountains, outsmart the trackers, and live as a king in the wilderness, then the lie falls apart. And that is why the maroon, the fugitive living in the wild, was such a dangerous figure. The story usually begins with a snap decision. For our subject, let's look at the profile of the men who did this. They were rarely field hands. They were often blacksmiths, woodworkers, or men who had been hired out to work on the edges of the property. They knew the terrain. In 1843, a man we will call the outlier, based on the composite realities of figures like the legendary Squire or the dismal swamp maroons, makes a choice. He's been threatened with the whip, or perhaps he is about to be sold away from his family. Most runaways in this era had a destination, north. The goal was distance, but the outlier realizes something critical. The roads to the north are patrolled. The bridges are watched. The slave catchers are waiting at the borders. To run north is to play their game. So he turns around. He looks toward the jagged peaks of the Blue Ridge or the dense, venomous thickets of the swamps, places white men avoided because they were too hard, too steep, or too wild. He walks into the green wall of the forest and vanishes. The first few weeks are not a cinematic adventure. They are a brutal test of human endurance. He has no tent, no gun, no fire starter. He has the clothes on his back and the knowledge in his head. This is where the transformation begins. To survive, he has to shed the conditioning of the plantation. He cannot wait for permission to eat. He cannot wait for orders. He must become apex.
Historical records from the 1840s describe wild men living in caves that were intricately fortified. These weren't holes in the ground, they were bunkers. The outlier finds a limestone cavern high up a ridge, accessible only by a thin ledge. He covers the entrance with brush. Inside, he builds a bed of furs, bear, deer, panther. But a man cannot live on scenery. He needs calories. This is where the story shifts from survival to guerrilla warfare. The plantation owners assumed that a runaway would starve and return within a week. When a week passes, then a month, then 6 months, the unease sets in. The outlier begins to raid. But he doesn't raid randomly. He targets the very man who claimed to own him. Under the cover of a moonless night, he slips back onto the property. He raids the corn cribs. He steals a cured ham. He takes a rifle. This is a psychological blow. Every morning, the master wakes up to find something missing. The power dynamic shifts. The master is now the one being watched. The master is the one locking his doors. The plantation, designed to be a prison for the slave, becomes a prison for the owner. By the mid-1840s, there were reports of entire communities of these men living in the Great Dismal Swamp on the border of Virginia and North Carolina and in the high mountains of Tennessee. They were known as Maroons. The specific mountain man archetype we are talking about, however, is the solitary figure, the lone wolf. The local newspapers would start to print stories. They wouldn't describe him as a clever survivor. That would give him too much credit. They described him as a monster, a wild beast. They dehumanized him to mask their fear. They claimed he had 7 fingers, or that he was 8 feet tall, or that he ate raw flesh. Why? Because if he is a monster, they are justified in hunting him. If he is just a man who wants to be free, they are the monsters. The investigation into these cases, looking back at the journals of sheriffs and bounty hunters from the 1840s, reveals a comedy of errors and systemic incompetence. The patrols would go out with dogs. Bloodhounds were the terror of the South. They were expensive, vicious, and supposedly inescapable. But the outlier knew this. He learned to walk in stream beds to wash away his scent. He learned to rub his boots with wild onions or turpentine to confuse the dogs' noses. There are accounts of Maroons who actually befriended the plantation dogs, feeding them scraps during night raids, so that when the posse came, the dogs wouldn't bark, they would wag their tails. Imagine the frustration of a sheriff leading a posse into the mountains. They are wearing heavy wool coats, sweating, angry, carrying heavy rifles. They are loud, they are clumsy. High above them, perched on a granite outcrop, the outlier watches them. He is lean, muscled from climbing, dressed in cured deerskin. He knows where they are going before they do. He could kill them, but he rarely does. Killing brings too much heat. Instead, he disappears. He becomes a ghost. As the months turn into years, a strange economy develops. The outlier needs things he can't make: gunpowder, salt, shoes. Here is the secret the official history often hides. He had help. The Underground Railroad wasn't just white abolitionists in the North. It was the enslaved people still on the plantation. The outlier would leave fresh game, a deer carcass or wild turkeys, at a designated spot near the slave quarters. In exchange, the enslaved community would leave him ammunition or cloth. He became a folk hero.
To the people in the cabins, he was proof that the master wasn't a god. He was proof that the woods weren't a death sentence. But let's zoom out to the broader mechanics of this life. It wasn't romantic, it was incredibly lonely.
The psychological toll of absolute isolation is shattering. You are always listening. A snapped twig could mean death. You can never truly sleep. By 1843, the mountain man slave had become a specific legal problem. Southern legislatures passed laws specifically targeting outliers. They authorized dead or alive bounties. This meant any white man could shoot a black man in the woods and claim a reward without asking questions. This created a season of blood. Bounty hunters, often poor white men who didn't own slaves but wanted the cash, began combing the hills. The climax of these stories usually involves a betrayal or a mistake. The outlier gets too comfortable. He lights a fire on a night when the wind carries the smoke the wrong way. Or he trusts the wrong person. In one famous account from this era, a maroon named Harry, a parallel to our archetype, held out for years until he was finally cornered. The posse didn't just want to capture him, they wanted to destroy the myth. They brought an entire militia. The standoff is where the mountain man legend solidifies. He doesn't beg. He fights with the terrain. He uses rock slides. He uses the choke points of the trails. He forces them to respect him as a combatant. When these men were finally caught or killed, the autopsy reports often shocked the coroners. They expected to find a starving, broken wretch. Instead, they found men in peak physical condition, with stomachs full of venison and muscles hardened by the vertical terrain. The authorities would display the body. They would hang the corpse in the town square. This was intended to be a warning. This is what happens when you run. But the warning often backfired. The enslaved people looked at the body and didn't see a failure. They saw a man who had lived free for 3, 5, or 10 years. They saw a man who had died on his feet, not on his knees. The mountain man slave of 1843 forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about the American frontier. We are taught that the mountain men were white explorers like Daniel Boone or Jedediah Smith. We are taught they conquered the wild. But there was another group of mountain men. They didn't explore the wild for glory. They embraced it for sanctuary. They didn't write memoirs. They didn't get statues. They were erased from the history books because their very existence was an insult to the slave power. They revealed that the system of slavery was fragile. It required constant violence to maintain. It required walls, chains, and laws. But the moment a man stepped past that wall and realized he could survive on his own, the system lost its power over his mind. In the end, the story of the escaped slave who became a feared mountain man is not just a story about a crime or a fugitive hunt. It is a story about the definition of humanity. When society treated them like cattle, they didn't accept the label. They returned to the oldest law of nature, survival of the fittest. They became the kings of the high country, looking down on the valley of their oppression. So the next time you look at the mist rolling over the Blue Ridge Mountains or the Great Smokies, don't just see the beauty. Remember the history hidden in the caves and the deep hollers. Remember the men who watched from the tree line, silent, armed, and free. They remind us that freedom isn't something that is given to you by a law or a piece of paper. Freedom is something you take, and sometimes it is something you have to hide in the woods to keep. If you found this story compelling and want to explore more forgotten corners of history that the textbooks left out, make sure to hit that like button. And for more deep dives into the shadows of the past, please subscribe to the channel.